Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me today. My name is Brendan Horahan and serve as Senior Consultant within our Threat and Vulnerability Management Remediation practice, or TVMR for short. Really do hope that you've enjoyed the great content so far at Source Zero Con. And again, thanks so much for just allowing me to speak to you today about a topic myself and a lot of others on our team are passionate about, specific to vulnerability remediation. Within TVMR, our goal is to work with our customers not just as consultants, but also in really the trusted advisor capacity. And that really allows us to fully assist in their remediation goals as well as their objectives. So what's the goal today in today's discussion? Really, it's to illustrate why there may be some missing value within current remediation efforts. And really what we want to do is illuminate some of the benefits of leveraging what we really call a lifecycle approach versus a linear one. And as we know, remediation programs, they come in all different shapes and sizes. So the goal of the discussion is really to help step through some of the basics on how we approach remediation today and identify and illustrate some of the hidden value when we change some of our thinking on how we actually approach this very important task. So why do we want to rethink remediation, right? Why do we want to even try to do this? And really, I think the important thing is to think a little bit beyond where current adoption of how we remediate vulnerabilities, right? And we kind of coin that more of a linear approach. And we want to try to shift our focus more from linear to life cycle. And some of the basics on what we see is, well, first, as the threat landscape is constantly changing and providing increasing challenges to organizations, we're using and leveraging those tool sets as really the primary visibility tool set when we assess our overall organizational risk, right? And we need to do that. That's really how it works today, right? Now, the tools, the talent, those services, they, come together and build that risk profile. But by doing so, what we're also finding is that there are sometimes missing elements that actually can restrict the risk visibility, which I think is very important. And so as we continue on our discussion, really that link is how the organizations approach remediation. So what's our goal? What's our objective, right? We really want to illustrate why there might be missing and hidden value within the current remediation effort and actually discuss some of the benefits of leveraging a lifecycle approach, right, versus a linear one. So to really get to the basics of this, we have to kind of talk a little bit of tech and see where remediation, its importance, the scoring, all of that, how it gets started. And all of this is something that a lot of folks in the audience are very familiar with. But I think it's a good foundational discussion to have because it's going to build on some things as we progress through our discussion today. And what we see on the screen here is something, again, we've all seen. This is a CVSS risk score provided by the First.org, who is the US-based nonprofit. They provide the risk scoring and metrics and really just provide that foundational component of where a vulnerability, when it's discovered, its risks, and then how the requisite tool sets leverage that. And the scoring capability is really broken down into three different quadrants or categories, right? We've got our base metric group that really just talks about the things here that are on the screen. And those are really the very straightforward. What does the vulnerability look like? What are the associated risks based on these particular criteria? Now, when we get into the temporal metrics, et cetera, this is where we actually look at confidence levels, remediation levels, the maturity of the exploits, and things like that. And I'm not going to go too terribly deep on this, but again, I wanted to just share some of the foundations of what comprises of these scores, and then what then is used within a lot of the tool sets that we use today. And so when we start looking at that, we get to kind of see a picture of the overall risk score profile, if you will. Okay. And what CVSS does is it provides an opportunity based on these three quadrants, again, base, temporal, and environmental, to paint a picture of how the vulnerability landscape looks, as well as the very important prioritization on what you should be focusing on from a remediation standpoint. There's one element in here that I want us to focus on as we continue our discussion, and these are the optional metrics. Today's vulnerability management tool sets are very, very capable. They're very good. However, they're not quite to the place where they completely understand your environment, your specifics, your business, your context. There is a lot of capability based on a lot of the external elements that those tool sets provide. But again, we're just really focusing on how the risk score and the prioritization takes place that really drive the remediation prioritization. So when we start looking at this, these tool sets and these dashboards, they look very familiar, right? They're taking those base CVSS scores. They're trying to get as much environmental context as possible, right, within their customer base and things of that nature. They're getting additional feeds and more insight into the vulnerability landscape, which again prioritizes our remediation. But there's something in here that again is somewhat missing, where when we look at the tool sets and the prioritizations that take place, at the end of the day, what we are still looking at is those base composite CVSS scores. Again, this is not to single out remediation tool sets or to say that these tool sets are inadequate, because that is not the purpose of this discussion. But what I want to focus on a little bit is just when we say linear versus life cycle, this is really what I'm trying to talk about or get at. When we look at the calculations of these scores, right, from base to temporal to environmental, we kind of see this as more of a linear approach because the scoring is available based on what context is available within the actual tool set. So because of these optional metrics, we want to really just say that there are times where there is limited context within the data sets that these systems provide. Again, they don't have the complete understanding of everything that's going on with the environment. So it's nothing bad on those tools. They do a great job. They just don't have all the site-specific information. But what that then means is when we look at remediation, we're really just then prioritization, or taking prioritization rather, based on severity and kind of that top-down approach. Now, is any of this wrong? No, absolutely not. What we're trying to do is framework now the thought-based discussion process of what we're seeing here, and then starting to kind of dive a little bit deeper into just some of the discussion-based, thought leadership on maybe some of the questions or concerns that organizations have that we've interacted with that aren't singling out tools or people or process, but what they're just asking very common, legitimate questions about their overall vulnerability remediation program. For example, why are we not getting ahead within the program, right? As we see more environments getting, met with substantially higher amounts of vulnerabilities, staying on top of that game is challenging right out of the gate. Or the desired results, right? We're not maybe perhaps meeting our SLAs, or we're going through our patching process, but we're seeing, now we're just not seeing the remediation results that we had hoped to see. And I think one of the other very important questions in this thought-based process discussion is, hey, look, we've got best of breed tool sets, we're using it, but are we really possibly still missing something within the remediation program, right? These are very, very good questions. And again, to emphasize, they're not here to place blame. on a particular person or tool set or technology. These are very important fundamental organization approach questions that really now assess the potential for the current review and potential improvement within the remediation process. So let's start kind of really just rethinking remediation now, right? And this is just all thought-based, right? So there's really no wrong answers here, but let's just start saying that now, because we have some of these feelings, or we're having some of these discussions in the back of our minds, I want to encourage us to really continue in that thought process. Do we have insight into the key tool sets and making sure that our remediation is the best it can be? Is there any room for improvement, right? Is the organization program aligned with our risk tolerance? As the threat and vulnerability landscape changes out there obviously is organizational risk and requisite risk tolerance. But I think it's really important to have periodic discussions about this to really say, okay, well, as these vectors are constantly changing out there, are we fully in line with how we approach our remediation versus what is within our risk tolerance or risk appetite tolerance, right? Folks will say, hey, how do we gauge our current remediation program effectiveness, right? Well, we're following SLAs, or maybe perhaps we're not, or we're struggling to. Does the organization have a very large remediation program with multiple teams, right? And they're prioritizing critical assets based on business impact or something to that effect. These are all really good questions to ask or revalidate when we look at these types of programs. And I think that inclusivity is really a big one, whereby the remediation program isn't, it's more static. It's not sometimes dynamic in nature. And again, this conversation is to get that shift from static to dynamic. And are we saying, hey, are we actually making sure we're remediating or have visibility into remediation efforts of all of our systems? There's sometimes, if you don't have, the ability to get that answer, we definitely need to continue this discussion. And I think, these also are very understandable questions when we look at the overall program. What is it that's missing, right? If you wake up at 2 a.m. and you just have this thought like, my gosh, okay, well, Patch Tuesday's coming around. Are we going to be able to tackle this huge amount of patches and, kind of meet our internal deadlines? Again, these are very, very good questions, and they're the beginning of the framework of getting into a linear versus a life cycle approach. So let's again take it another step further. Holding on to these great questions and thoughts that we have, right? Let's just expand upon this a little bit. And let's just kind of now envision, what does it actually look like, right? What do we want to achieve? What could provide more value that may be missing from the current remediation strategy? And one of the things is we always say context. And when we work with our customers, when we get context, it's really additional depth and understanding specific, for example, to asset identification, the criticality of the asset, who owns the asset, not just from a technical standpoint, from a business standpoint too, specific, for example, to end-of-life operating systems. Or do we have the ability to integrate with other systems in the environment to prove the vulnerability visibility? And when I say that, visibility meaning, are we allowing the integration perhaps of our CMDB or of our asset management system or our threat management or endpoint systems to provide a little bit more visibility into how we're actually leveraging our remediation to make sure we're ticking off all the boxes when we go down that journey. A lot of times we also say to ourselves, well, geez, when we look back at the tool sets, we've got best of breed, but I'm not sure if they're actually working or there's overlap, or maybe we're not leveraging all of the capabilities in these systems where they may be going unutilized that could provide value to the organization. And really, I think the most important thing is really just trying to challenge the norm of if we assume that everything is working well within our remediation program, that's usually when at a time where we actually are trying to, seek comfort in an area of probably some discomfort. Because a lot of times, if we assume everything and all is well, we're probably not actually, fully thinking things through, and there are opportunities for improvement. So now that we have some thoughts and some questions in our mind, let's kind of visualize this together, okay? And let's just review a little bit about what we've talked about. And we're going to start kind of visualizing the transformation of what this will look like when we talk about linear versus life cycle, and just really highlight some of the benefits of getting some of those elements more into the remediation programs. So as we just saw in this slide, we're looking at just kind of the current state where our remediation tool sets are very capable. They're providing good positive insight. They're saying, hey, these are the severities. This is your prioritization. At the end of the day, because again, those systems have good, context within their capabilities within today's technological, realm, if you will. At the end, though, it's still severity priority-based remediation, kind of top down. And there's, again, nothing wrong with that. But let's now try to shift this mindset with a lot of what organizations are doing today. And maybe let's think about a future state. What does it look like when we actually start looking more within a life cycle remediation approach? Well, first and foremost, our goal is to get remediation in the mix. We want to succeed and do well in our remediation efforts, right? We want to do the best we can do to meet our SLAs, make sure that, we're fully adequately patched at all times. And we really want the process repeatable, and we really want the process understandable throughout the organization. So when we draw this out, there are probably some other elements that are coming into play, but I just kind of picked some of the top ones. I think that from the inside of the life cycle, as we build this out, there starts to be some core kind of fundamental concepts on how does this now start to look when we start visualizing more of a life cycle approach. I think first and foremost is asset discovery and prioritization. We can't lower our organizational threat profile if we really don't have a grasp on the assets and the prioritization of those assets within the organization. That's a very challenging element. You might think like everything, but again, I would offer to just kind of challenge some of that and say, do we really have this under our belt, and do we fully understand it? When we now have that and we understand organization, assets, the prioritization, who owns what, et cetera, we then match that up to requisite risk levels within the organization, right? So that way we can not only just take some of that, high severity critical highs when we looked at the previous slide, but we can match some of that up to the requisite organizational risks with the systems and the specific organizational elements that you do in your day-to-day operations that help guide remediation. When we look at the third core, and again, there could be a few more of these, right? I just kind of focus on what I see in here working with our customers is making sure that the life cycle as we build it is effective, right? When we build it, we want it to grow, mature, succeed, and also repeat. So now that we have some of these elements, we want to codify those. And we're going to now build and zero in on specific elements within these three quadrants that really talk more about the specifics of what we're actually trying to do. So in asset discovery and prioritization, I really encourage our customers to leverage, check, or just review, starting from right to left, the asset database management, the CMDB. Integrate that with your remediation program, making sure that not just endpoints or servers, but all the devices are actually inclusive, so there's visibility in the remediation program whereby the asset database has everything we need to at least understand, okay, how are we going to approach this? What we then also encourage with customers is to augment the discovery and prioritization component is really making sure that our, leveraging additional tool sets that can help fill that picture or really maintain that picture. Endpoint security, Active Directory, those tools are I feel very important and can be leveraged within remediation programs whereby these are systems that can be used as an additional barometer to detect, okay, this system's on the network, it's off the network, it's new on the network, and making sure that it's part of the overall remediation strategy, because assets, as we all know, especially working today in COVID, is that they're on the network, off the network, maybe new to the network, or being decommissioned. And knowing the status of all those devices are really fundamental elements of how we approach remediation, because we know where devices are. When we look at workstations and servers, I had to say again, we want to make sure we're capturing all these devices. Printers, IoT, anything that wirelessly or wired connects to a network within the organization should be captured, should be discovered, should be understood and prioritized. Shifting to risk, and just kind of, again, moving our way clockwise, is really just discovering threats within the organization. And that's pretty self-explanatory, right? If we have the asset and it's tied to the vulnerability management platform, it's going to discover requisite threats that could provide or illuminate risk into your organization. Okay. And so when we see that, we then can look at the actual controls from an organizational risk standpoint that actually can augment remediation efforts, right? And further assess the risk. And when we say that, we're leveraging controls like maybe it's a SIM or some sort of log monitoring solution, where we are actually helping or have the additional insight and capability to complete a picture where we say, okay, these controls are missing or needed to help realize where the overall risk is. And then as we transition again, clockwise moving forward, we then talk about the actual impact of not being able to remediate, or maybe there's some inhibitor that could play a role in the remediation effort. These pieces are very important and are part of the life cycle because, unfortunately, as I stated earlier, no organization is the same. There are some devices that may be very sensitive to patching remediation, and we really need to understand what the level of risk is to the organization, and moving up forward, either accepting for that risk or introducing some sort of compensating control to that risk. But the most important thing is making sure that that risk is illuminated within the remediation lifecycle and communicated to stakeholders within the organization. As we continue to build our remediation lifecycle out, this is really where it gets fun, because what we want to do is make sure the program is sustainable and effective, right? And so I think that indicators for success, I really think, are just really the hallmark, and they can be simple as calculating the total number of vulnerabilities versus how much you've remediated in that particular month of Patch Tuesday, right? Or how long it took to remediate. There are all sorts of different calculations out there that you can leverage. I would just say keep it simple, but have something to make sure that you have the ability to measure your program's effectiveness. The effectiveness of the tool set is of equal importance, right? When we discover vulnerabilities within our vulnerability management framework, that's obviously one thing. But if you can't effectively remediate within your current tool set, obviously that's another story. So we want to make sure that those tool sets are working, administrators are leveraging them to their fullest capacity and capability, and that they're used on a repeatable process. I think, again, going around clockwise as far as metrics, leverage ones that work for your organization. I really can't emphasize it enough. Every organization and every vulnerability remediation program varies. And the real goal is to make sure that the program and the framework is in place. And obviously that you're using metrics that actually work to make sure that the program is effective. There are some times when we're working with customers that are leveraging maybe metrics that are not applicable to their specific organization or tool set, and they're now no longer in alignment with the overall program. So what does that do? Well, of course, it creates a skew because when you report our remediation success to the board, things are obviously not going to look very accurate. And we want to make sure, again, that those metrics are aligned with what you're trying to achieve within your remediation lifecycle. I think the last element here is probably, well, they're all important to me, but getting full organizational support is huge. A top-down buy-in when a new vulnerability management and a remediation lifecycle approach is introduced into the organization, the full buy-in, it really ensures that there's going to be success when it comes to remediation, because there's going to be times when conversations will take place where there's going to be unsupported software or unsupported operating systems that no longer can be updated, right? Where we just can't patch it. We have to discuss additional things like compensating controls, or we have unsecured or exposed ports to critical public-facing systems that may need to be revisited and look at perhaps improving some sort of compensating control to improve our security levels, right? Or our SLAs are just not being met. These components, I think, are very, very important to make sure that we get what we need to do to get that full buy-in support. So let's build it one step further. We're going to now tie all this together and really see the value now of our future desired state, where we have asset lifecycle visibility, we have more improved remediation context, right? We're integrating tools, CMDB, we're getting all of our devices, we're leveraging additional checks with systems such as Active Directory or endpoint security. We have more context, more prioritization. We have an additional awareness within our organizational risk and our risk appetites and how we're going to approach that when it comes to situations which will happen, as we all know, where we're not really able to remediate. We also then want to make sure that we have measurable outcomes. We have alignment within our tool sets and improved organizational support, making sure that we get buy-in within the new remediation approach as we shift from that linear to lifecycle based approach. So what does it mean when we tie it all together? Well, it's measurable, it's repeatable, and it's a structure, I think, that can really provide a level of sustainability and can provide accountability as we focus in on the core of remediation, expand out and look at all these elements that are part of the life cycle. And we focus on that holistically as we build it, maintain it, and repeat it going forward. So on that note, that's pretty much all I have. I'm pretty much out of time, but I definitely wanted to say thank you so much for your time. I hope this discussion was helpful. I would love to have, or take any questions or comments. We have a few extra moments into the session. And if not, there's a lot of folks on the team here within SourceZeroCon that can direct some of these questions specific to remediation. I'd love to speak to you offline. But really, again, thanks so much for listening about maybe rethinking remediation. And I hope you do enjoy the rest of SourceZeroCon and have a great day. Thanks so much.